During the campaign of the French army besieging Turin in 1536, the young military surgeon Ambroise Pare witnessed the agony of several seriously wounded soldiers. An experienced soldier sitting next to him asked the surgeon if the unfortunate had any chances. Having received a negative answer, he cut the throat of the wounded in front of the indignant surgeon. This seemingly cruel act had a good reason behind it, considering the treatment methods used at those times. In this episode of How It Was, we will talk about surgery during the period when surgeons weren't considered actual physicians and the treatment was more like torture. You will learn why the church persecuted the Lancet masters, what role hot iron and boiling oil played in healing wounds, why some patients had to operate on themselves, and how, thanks to the operation upon King Louis XIV, surgeons finally received the status of doctors. Until the 18th century, there was a sharp division between doctors and surgeons in many European countries. Doctors were the elite. They received medical education at universities and were engaged in the treatment of diseases. Surgeons, specialists in the treatment of fractures, dislocations and wounds, were considered artisans. They were not allowed into the class of doctors, did not have the right to write prescriptions, but studied directly in practice, assisting in hospitals and surgical schools. Even when they performed the most complicated operations, they were considered only assistants of real doctors, and they were paid much less. Therefore, until the end of the 17th century, surgery was not a prestigious profession. Surgeons were in the same guild as barbers, who were also allowed to do bloodletting, remove stones, bandage wounds, and remove teeth. They cut with the same razors they shaved, only rinsing them in water and heating them on fire. This was considered normal. Modern antiseptic methods were developed only in the second half of the 19th century. Would you take the risk of being operated on by your hairdresser? Surgery is impossible without a deep knowledge of anatomy, but the church strongly condemned the mockery of bodies. Autopsies were allowed to be carried out very rarely and only with the authorities' permission. For example, in 1231, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II allowed the super-prestigious Salemo Medical School to open one corpse every 5 years. The bodies were dissected solemnly in special amphitheaters. Respected professors did not humiliate themselves working with a scalpel. They only told the surgeon what to do. The students present were silent spectators, and many even finished their studies without waiting for the anatomical performance. Not surprisingly, the surgeon's qualifications left much to be desired. Andreas Vesalius, the founder of scientific anatomy, tried to fight the existing state of affairs. After 4 years of study at the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Paris, he complained, "No one has ever shown me any bones or muscles, let alone blood vessels." Legally, only bones could be studied, but one also had to search for them at cemeteries. Fortunately, corpses were often buried shallowly, and the bones could be found right on the surface. Vesalius wrote that he almost left his own bones at a cemetery in search of human bones because he was nearly torn apart by hungry dogs. In 1537, Vesalius was offered the chair of surgery and anatomy at the University of Padua, where autopsies were already being actively carried out. In Padua, Vesalius became the leading anatomist. He cut the corpses personally. In 1543, he published his masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or The Structure of the Human Body. But both doctors and the church immediately revolted against him. Doctors were outraged by criticism of the views of the ancient Greek master of medicine Galen, and theologians accused the author of blasphemy. After all, he dared to assert that the number of ribs for a man and a woman is the same, while the Bible says that God created Eve from the rib of Adam, which means that a man should have one more rib. As a result, Vesalius was suspended from teaching, publicly condemned, and expelled from the city. With the spread of firearms, the need for surgeons increased. It was believed that the cause of suppuration was the powder poison that had penetrated the body of the wounded was the cause of the suppuration wounds. The famous book of the Italian surgeon Giovanni da Vigo, The Art of Surgery, in 1514, which withstood more than 50 editions in different languages, advised cauterizing the wound with a hot iron and pouring it with boiling vegetable oil. The person who stopped these barbaric practices was Maître Ambroise Pare, the future first surgeon of the 4 French kings. In 1537, he treated the soldiers following the advice of Da Vigo. There was no anesthesia. Unsurprisingly, many soldiers preferred death to such treatment. He squeezed the neck of an iron funnel in the hole punched by a bullet, pouring boiling elderberry oil into it. However, there were many wounded, there was not enough oil, and they had to try a cold mixture based on egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine for treatment. That night, I could not sleep easily, he later wrote in a book, thinking that by default in cautery I would find the wounded to whom I had failed to apply the said oil dead of poisoning, and this made me get up at first light to visit them. Beyond my hopes, I found those on whom I had put the digestive dressing feeling little pain from their wounds, which were not swollen or inflamed, and having spent quite a restful night. But the others to whom the said oil had been applied I found fevered, with great pain and swelling around their wounds. From then I resolved never again to cruelly burn poor men wounded with arquebus shot. At the same time, Ambroise Pare proposed a new way to stop bleeding. At the time, if a large vessel was damaged during injury or amputation, then cauterization of the wounds with a red-hot iron was used to stop the bleeding. If that didn't work, the stump was dipped in boiling oil to cicatrize the wound. The bleeding stopped, but often the burn tissue began to rot and the patient died from blood poisoning. Pare suggested dressing the blood vessels with an ordinary strong thread. Since then, vascular ligation has been the primary method of the treatment for bleeding during operations. We categorically do not recommend repeating the following method of treatment at home. At the beginning of the 17th century, Amsterdam was shocked by the story of the blacksmith Jan de Doot, a patient who operated on himself. Suffering from urolithasis, Jan de Doot was twice unsuccessfully operated on by surgeons. Finally, for the third time, the exhausted blacksmith decided to act independently, calling only his brother for help. The latter held the patient's scrotum and he cut himself and removed the stone, the size of the chicken egg and weighing 4 ounces, and only to treat the vast wound, a surgeon was eventually called. Even though lithotomy, removal of stones from the body, even carried out by a specialist in those days, in 40% of the cases ended in the patient's death. For Jan de Doot, everything ended well. The blacksmith even became a local celebrity. After the operation, he often posed for artists and engravers with a quarried stone held in his hand. The blacksmith's distrust of doctors can be understood by reading the Chronicle of Diseases by the French King Louis XIV. From 1647 to 1711, the monarch's doctors kept a diary of his illnesses. For example, a record dated November the 11th, 1647, testifies that a 9-year-old Louis had a fever, which was treated with blood buzzing from the elbow vein according to the customs of that time. A good effect was noted, the doctor writes in his diary, from the second bloodletting. On the same day, the child's body was covered in pustules. The king was diagnosed with smallpox. The bloodletting was repeated 4 times. The 5th bloodletting was replaced by the use of a laxative. Doctors constantly attacked the monarch's body with enemas, bloodletting, and laxatives. During his life, the Sun King endured about 2,000 enemas. Louis was lucky. He had iron health. There was no doubt that only this allowed him to survive numerous diseases and their debilitating treatment. However, sometimes surgeons still performed miracles and saved patients even in the most difficult cases. One example is the amazing story of the first stomach surgery in Europe. On Trinity Day of 1635, 22-year-old Andreas Grunheide, a peasant from East Prussia, seriously overate. A friend advised him to induce vomiting by tickling his larynx with a knife handle. Never do that. Andreas thrust the weapon too deep, involuntarily swallowing, and the knife fell into the esophagus. The poor man was sent to Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, for consultation with the medical faculty of the local university. For 1.5 months, the doctors waited for the knife to come out on its own. They did not dare to operate because most operations in the abdominal cavity and chest in those days turned out to be fatal. But the painful patient persuaded them to make the incision. On July the 9th, 1635, the operation was performed by Daniel Schwabe, a wound and lithotomy surgeon, of course without anesthesia. Andreas was given broth and nutmeg tincture to drink to strengthen heart activity. The patient was bound to a board, the knife located with a magnet, and the site selected for the incision over the palpable point of the swallowed knife was marked with charcoal. On its withdrawal, Grunheld joyfully announced it was his knife. During the operation, the patient lost consciousness several times, but he was brought to his senses. The gastric wound was closed and the patient recovered completely, returning to his farm work. He got married, had children, and outlived his savior. The operation was so sensational that the patient and knife were immortalized by an oil painting, and the King of Prussia retained the knife as a souvenir. But despite this success in many countries, surgeons for another century didn't have a professional status equal to that of doctors of medicine. A chance changed everything. In 1686, Louis XIV developed a perianal abscess that, after a series of failed treatment attempts, developed into an anal fistula, a canal leading from the colon out to the skin. This condition required surgical intervention. Before such a risky operation, legend has it that the royal surgeon trained on impoverished patients and prisoners using a special miniature surgical knife. When the fateful hour came, Louis XIV prayed, laying down on his bed, and then gave the order to begin. The operation was, of course, performed with no painkillers. It was recorded that the king never uttered a sound. Only once, in a moment of absolutely unbearable pain, he quietly said, "Lord." But the ordeal wasn't over. Unfortunately, the surgeon found that he did not wholly cut the fistula, and 3 weeks later, he had to perform another surgery to avoid complications. In a painful 6-hour operation, the surgeon performed his final procedure. Luckily, the operation was a massive success and the king made a full recovery. After this story, having a fistula even became somewhat fashionable. The surgeon Pierre Dionys recalls that there were some people mad enough not only to boast of having the same condition and having the same treatment as the monarch, but to actually ask surgeons to operate on them when they didn't even have a fistula. Meanwhile, Georges Marechal, the first royal surgeon of Louis XIV, advanced the cause of the surgeons, pressing the king to create a higher educational institute for surgeons, the Royal Academy of Surgery. But due to the opposition of certified doctors, it was opened only on December 18, 1731 by Louis XV. As one of the arguments in favour of its opening, Marechal cited the story of the royal fistula. The centuries-old dispute between doctors and surgeons was won by the latter. Did you like this video? Then tell your friends about it. Subscribe to our channel, there's lots of exciting content waiting for you.